talk about the advantages of growing tea from seeds. The nice thing about tea grown from seed is that it has a taproot, and that taproot can go several feet down into the ground over time. And that, roots from that taproot then spread out. It provides resilience to the plant that's there. So that's one good reason to grow tea from seeds. Another is, well, it can be an advantage or a disadvantage, is that you have more genetic diversity in your plants. You just have it's another type of resilience. You yourself in the garden or on a farm have the resilience by having that amount of diversity in your garden. And the other reason I like to grow tea from seeds is it's really fun to see them come up from this little thing to one of these guys. So we normally grow our seeds for the nursery in trays and then separate them out and pot up those seedlings once they've reached a certain height or age. You need to have at least a couple of leaves on them before we pot them up. In the garden, on the other hand, you just put them in the ground and don't even have to barely cover them. Mother Nature, the tea seeds fall from the plant and drop in the ground, and the dirt or the leaf litter that you have there, and then the next year they sprout. So we're emulating that, either planting them ourselves in the garden or planting them in trays in the greenhouse. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks in the warm months to germinate and grow tea from seeds. I've known some people who had trouble, I think because the temperatures just weren't high enough. So if you live in a place where the summer temperatures don't get that warm, like above 70 or 80, you can always use a heat mat under your tray, and you can do that indoors in the winter as well. So the tea takes maybe 1 to 2 months to grow from a seed into a little seedling, and then at that point you can begin potting it up into larger pots if you're growing it in pots. Or if you're growing it in the garden just as such, you're just going to begin weeding really carefully around that. Actually, during that time while the seed is waking up, you actually have to keep it moist. So you have to continue watering it on a regular basis so that the seed doesn't dry out. In fact, drying out is the biggest problem that people have trying to start tea from seeds, because they might get them from some source overseas. Usually, you don't really know how they're collected, but they will dry out if they're not kept in a moist environment, and that can make them less viable, or they just don't sprout at all if they completely dry out. So once you have that seedling, you would pot it up to a slightly larger pot. So if you started in a small pot or cell of a tray, you just go up a little bit. You don't want to have a ratio of too much soil to plant if you're growing it in pots, because it makes it harder to regulate the moisture in the plant. So it's better to start with a small seedling in a small pot, and then grow it like that for 6 months to a year before then potting it up to a next size up. That's optimal. You do have to water regularly, but you don't have to worry as much about either drying out because the water diffuses or becoming oversaturated because it doesn't dry out or drain. So if you have a bunch of seeds and you want to know, are they viable, the most commonly used method is to simply drop them in a pot of water, and the ones that sink to the bottom are good. They're fresh. So sometimes you'll have some that will float on the top, but over time, if you leave them in the water for 24 to 48 hours, they will begin to sink down. And that's a good thing. They're just getting sort of rehydrated. And if you want to speed up that process or encourage it further, you can just have something that weighs down the seeds to hold them under the water rather than letting them float on top of the water. But truly, I don't recommend throwing away the floaters if you have a limited quantity of seed, because often some will sprout as long as you're treating them, like the other seeds and making sure that they stay moist in the tray. They will sprout. So, but When you do source your seeds from unknown vendors, and especially I think overseas where you just don't know how they're collecting them and storing them over time. Often they fall to the ground and then you sweep them up. We actually pluck our seeds when they're still in the plant for the most part. We do this for two reasons. One is they're still in this capsule and that keeps them moist. We wait until the capsules are starting to turn a little brownish. We know they're ripe. Usually at about the same time the flowers are blooming, you can pretty much count on the seeds being ready to harvest. And then we take them home and we spread them out and they begin cracking. And then right away we collect them and we put them into an airtight container with a little bit of a moist paper towel, for example, and pop them in the refrigerator. And that the refrigeration, that whole thing, again, serves a couple of purposes, but mainly it's to keep the seeds from drying out. And then also by going into the refrigerator, you're doing something called stratification. And the stratification, sort of a normal part of the seed life cycle in the garden, they need to cool down. It also makes it so that all the seeds you have been sort of brought to the same timeline. But if you don't stratify the seeds, they'll still sprout, but they might sprout at different rates, so to even it out, and for long-term storage or waiting until they're ready to plant, we keep them in the refrigerator. And you can do that for a year or two. We've had viable seeds, that are 2 years old.